May 1943, Berlin. Admiral Karl Dönitz stood in the map room of the Kriegsmarine headquarters, staring at the Atlantic chart with a dread that had been building for weeks. 23 U-boats lost in a single month. 23. His hand moved across the plotting table, touching each red marker that represented a submarine that would never return. Behind him, staff officers waited in silence, knowing what he was about to say, knowing the question that had become unavoidable. "They're reading our mail," Dönitz said quietly. "There's no other explanation." The words hung in the air like a death sentence. Because if the British were reading German naval communications, if they had broken Enigma, then every operation, every patrol position, every rendezvous point had been compromised for years. Every sailor sent to sea had been sailing into a trap. The entire U-boat campaign, the weapon that was supposed to strangle Britain, had been fighting with its throat already cut. But Dönitz was wrong. Not about the Allies reading German communications. He was right about that. He was wrong about what would happen next, wrong about whether anyone would believe him, and catastrophically wrong about what Adolf Hitler would say when confronted with the possibility that Germany's most secret communication system had been compromised for years. The story of how close Nazi leadership came to discovering the truth about Enigma, and why they ultimately convinced themselves of a comfortable lie instead, reveals something profound about the nature of intelligence failure. It wasn't that they lacked evidence. The warning signs were everywhere, accumulating like water against a dam. It was that the truth was simply too terrible to accept. Enigma seemed unbreakable because it was, by any reasonable measure, extraordinarily secure. The machine itself was elegant in its simplicity. A keyboard connected to a series of rotors, each rotor wired to scramble the alphabet in a different pattern. Press a key, current flows through the rotors, a lamp lights up showing the encrypted letter. The receiving operator, with rotors set to the same starting position, types the encrypted message and watches the original text appear on the lamps. But the genius was in the mathematics. 3 rotors, each with 26 positions, created over 17,000 possible starting positions. Add a plug board that could swap letter pairs, and the number of possible settings exploded into the hundreds of millions. The German cryptographers had calculated it precisely, 159 million possible configurations. To break a single message, an enemy would need to test every possible rotor setting and plug board combination. Even if you could test one setting per second, it would take longer than the age of the universe. The mathematics were absolute. Enigma was unbreakable. Except it wasn't. And by 1943, the British had been reading German naval Enigma for years, reading it so completely that they knew U-boat positions better than some German commanders did. But the Germans didn't know this, couldn't know this, because accepting it meant accepting that everything they believed about cryptographic security was wrong. The first serious scare came in May 1941, after the battleship Bismarck was hunted down and destroyed. The British had found Bismarck in the vastness of the Atlantic with what seemed like impossible precision. German naval intelligence investigated. Had Enigma been compromised? They brought in their best cryptographers, examined the mathematics again, reviewed the procedures. The conclusion was unanimous: impossible. The British must have gotten lucky with reconnaissance aircraft, or perhaps there was a spy. But not Enigma. Never Enigma. Hitler accepted this explanation because it fit what he already believed. He trusted German engineering, trusted German science, trusted the experts who assured him that the machine was mathematically perfect. When told that British direction-finding technology had improved, that radar had become more sophisticated, that there might be traitors in the Kriegsmarine, he nodded. These explanations made sense. They were comfortable. They didn't require questioning the fundamental assumptions of German military communications. But the evidence kept accumulating. In the Mediterranean in 1942, German supply convoys to North Africa were being intercepted with disturbing regularity. Field Marshal Rommel, desperate for fuel and ammunition in the North African desert, watched convoy after convoy get destroyed before reaching port. He suspected the British had broken German codes. He said so explicitly in reports. But the cryptographers investigated again and reached the same conclusion: mathematically impossible. The Kriegsmarine did take one precaution. In February 1942, they added a fourth rotor to the naval Enigma machines, creating what they called Triton. The number of possible settings increased exponentially. For 10 months, the British were indeed blind, unable to read German naval traffic. U-boats operated freely. Sinkings of Allied merchant ships spiked dramatically. It seemed to prove that Enigma was secure. If the British had broken it before, surely they would still be reading it now. But in December 1942, the blackout ended. The British broke 4-rotor Enigma, and in early 1943, the U-boat war turned into a slaughter. The numbers were impossible to ignore. In March 1943, 15 U-boats lost. In April, 15 more. In May, the 23 that had so shaken Dönitz. These weren't random losses scattered across the ocean. U-boats were being attacked at their rendezvous points, at their refueling positions, along their patrol routes. Allied convoys were dodging wolf packs with precision, as if they knew exactly where the submarines would be. Dönitz was not a stupid man. He had spent 4 years waging submarine warfare, 4 years studying patterns and statistics. The losses weren't random. They couldn't be. On May 1st, 1943, he ordered a complete security review. Every possibility had to be examined, including the one possibility that everyone insisted was impossible. The investigation was thorough. German cryptographers, led by Dr. Wilhelm Tranow, examined every aspect of Enigma security. They looked at the mathematics again. They tested the machines for electromagnetic emissions that might be detectable. They reviewed operator procedures for any weakness that might allow code breaking. They even considered whether the Allies might have captured an Enigma machine and somehow used it to break the code. Their report was unequivocal. Enigma remained secure. The losses must be attributed to other factors. Improved Allied radar, better direction-finding equipment, possibly some new detection technology the Germans didn't understand yet. The report acknowledged that some messages might be compromised through operator error or if machines were captured, but systematic reading of Enigma traffic? Mathematically impossible. The numbers didn't lie. Except the numbers did lie. Or rather, the Germans were asking the wrong question. They calculated how long it would take to break Enigma by brute force, testing every possible setting. The answer was impossibly long. But the British weren't using brute force. They were using mathematics, exploiting weaknesses in how Enigma was used, using electromechanical computers that could test thousands of settings per second, using human insight to narrow the possibilities. The German cryptographers never imagined that anyone could build machines fast enough or clever enough to do what Bletchley Park was doing every single day. When Dönitz received the report, he wanted to believe it. The alternative was too terrible. If Enigma had been broken, it meant that every U-boat he'd sent out for the past 2 years had been sent into a trap. It meant that thousands of submariners had died because he'd given them orders that the enemy was reading in real time. The psychological weight of that possibility was crushing, but he couldn't quite let it go. In discussions with his staff, he kept returning to the question: the British were too accurate, too consistent. Yes, they had better technology. Yes, their radar had improved. But this precise, this reliable? His subordinates pushed back. If Enigma was broken, they argued, why hadn't the British destroyed every single U-boat? Why did some submarines still successfully attack convoys? Why were there any German naval victories at all? Surely, if the British could read every message, German naval operations would be completely impossible. It was a persuasive argument, and it was based on a false assumption. The British didn't act on every decoded message because doing so would reveal that they were reading German communications. They let some U-boats succeed. They allowed some convoys to be attacked. They carefully managed how they used ultra-intelligence, always providing a cover story, always maintaining the illusion that their success came from radar or reconnaissance or lucky guesses. The Germans, looking at their partial successes, convinced themselves that their codes must be secure. Dönitz took his concerns to Hitler in late May 1943, during a conference about the U-boat crisis. The losses were unsustainable. Something had to change. He raised the possibility, carefully, that German communications might be compromised. Hitler's reaction was immediate and certain. Impossible. The Führer had been briefed on Enigma's security, had been told by experts that the system was unbreakable. He believed in German technical superiority, believed that German engineering and German science were the finest in the world. The suggestion that British cryptographers had somehow outsmarted German security was not just wrong, it was insulting. The losses, Hitler declared, were due to betrayal. There were spies in the Kriegsmarine, traitors feeding information to the British. Or perhaps the Italians were being careless with their communications and the British were using that to locate German submarines. Or the Americans had developed some new detection technology. But German codes were secure. He ordered increased security measures, more aggressive counterintelligence, investigations into possible traitors. He did not order any change to Enigma procedures or any further cryptographic review. The experts had spoken. The matter was settled. Dönitz left the meeting with his concerns unresolved, but his orders clear. The U-boat campaign would continue. Enigma would continue to be used. The losses would have to be accepted as the price of the Atlantic battle. But the admiral couldn't quite convince himself. In his personal war diary, he wrote that he feared the worst but had to proceed as if communications were secure because the alternative was operational paralysis. If they assumed Enigma was broken, they would have to stop using it, which meant they would have no way to coordinate submarine operations at all. Better to use a possibly compromised system than to have no system at all. It was a rationalization, but it was also practical reality. The German Navy had no backup plan, no alternative communication system ready to deploy. Enigma was the foundation of all naval operations. Questioning it meant questioning everything. Throughout the summer of 1943, the debate continued within German naval intelligence. Some officers remained convinced that British success was too consistent to be explained by technology alone. Others pointed to the mathematical proofs, the expert assessments, the sheer impossibility of breaking Enigma by any known method. The arguments went in circles, always returning to the same conclusion: it must be secure because the alternative was unthinkable. The Germans did make changes, but not the right ones. They tightened radio procedures, changed code books more frequently, added security measures around when and how Enigma was used. These changes had some effect, making the British codebreakers work harder, but they never addressed the fundamental vulnerability because they never admitted it existed. Hitler himself never revisited the question. Once he had decided that Enigma was secure, the matter was closed in his mind. When losses continued, he blamed commanders, blamed tactics, blamed equipment quality, blamed everything except the possibility that the enemy was reading his orders before his own submarines received them. The psychology of this failure is striking. The Germans had evidence. They had warning signs. They had officers like Dönitz who suspected the truth. But they also had experts who assured them it was impossible. Mathematical proofs that seemed absolute, and a cognitive burden so heavy that accepting the truth would have meant accepting that they had been catastrophically wrong for years. It's easier to believe in spies and bad luck than to believe that your fundamental assumptions about security are wrong. It's easier to trust the experts who tell you what you want to hear than to follow the evidence to an unbearable conclusion. And so, the war continued. U-boats sailed on patrols that the British were reading about before the submarines left port. German naval operations were planned with meticulous care and transmitted via Enigma to units whose positions the Allies already knew. The Atlantic battle raged on, with German submariners fighting bravely while their enemy read their orders in real time. In late 1943, German intelligence did capture some evidence that should have been definitive. A German agent in Stockholm reported that the British were openly discussing their ability to read German naval codes. The report was investigated and dismissed. Clearly, the agent had been fed disinformation, or was reporting barroom gossip, or had misunderstood something. The British wouldn't be so careless as to actually discuss such a capability if they had it, would they? They would, because they knew the Germans would never believe it. The truth was so far outside German assumptions about what was possible that even when they heard it directly, they rejected it as obviously false. Hitler never learned the truth. He died in his bunker in April 1945, still believing that Enigma was secure, still trusting in the mathematical proofs and expert assessments that had been wrong from the beginning. In his final days, as the Reich collapsed around him, he blamed betrayal, blamed cowardice, blamed the weakness of his subordinates. He never knew that the enemy had been reading his most secret communications for years. The revelation came decades later. In 1974, a British intelligence officer named F.W. Winterbotham published a book called The Ultra Secret, revealing for the first time the full extent of Allied code-breaking during World War II. The British had broken Enigma, not occasionally, not partially, but systematically and completely. They had read German communications throughout the war, had known German plans, had tracked German movements, had used this intelligence to devastating effect. The surviving German officers who read Winterbotham's book were stunned. Dönitz, still alive in 1974, finally understood why his U-boats had died in such numbers. The suspicion he'd voiced in 1943 had been correct. The experts who had assured him it was impossible had been wrong. The mathematical proofs had been irrelevant because the British had found a different approach, one the Germans had never imagined. What Hitler said when confronted with the evidence that Enigma might be broken was, essentially, that it was impossible and therefore couldn't be true. He said it with the certainty of someone who trusted experts, who believed in German technical superiority, who couldn't imagine that the fundamental assumptions of his military communications were wrong. He said it, and thousands died because he was wrong. The tragedy wasn't that Enigma was breakable. The tragedy was that the Germans came so close to figuring it out, had officers who suspected the truth, had evidence that pointed in the right direction, but convinced themselves that the comfortable lie was more believable than the terrible truth. Intelligence failures rarely come from lack of information. They come from the inability to accept what the information is telling you, especially when it contradicts everything you believe about how the world works. The Germans had the best cryptographic technology of their era. They had brilliant mathematicians, they had security procedures and expert analysis. What they didn't have was the ability to imagine that they might be fundamentally wrong. Hitler never learned that Enigma was broken because he never believed it could be broken.